The title of our talk is Living Life to the Full. And just because I believe that humour is very important to healthy living, we're going to start with a poem about health, which I found particularly fun. It goes something like this. In life, we have choices, the healthy and not. And sometimes it's tricky to choose what we ought. So if you are wondering what will make you ill, it's easy to know, because everything will. A is for alcohol, source of addiction, liver diseases and other afflictions. So how about water? That might be okay. But if it's in plastic, there's B, BPA. C is for corn syrup, soda pop users, and also for carbs found in sugary juices. D, dehydration. You still have to drink, though all of these beverages seem like they stink. Eating too little or too much to count? E is for eating in perfect amounts and eating some foods that you shouldn't consume, because dozens of dishes will lead to your doom. F is for fried food that's filled up with fat. Gluten for G, if you buy into that. H is for hot dogs. Who knows how they're made? I for insecticide. Veggies are sprayed. J is for jerky with way too much salt. And K is for kale, which is also at fault. But isn't it healthy? I'm glad that you asked. Cabbage and kale make thyroids too fast. Forget about eating, we'll just go outside. But that is where even more dangers can hide. L is for Lyme disease, carried by ticks. Malaria, M, that mosquitoes inflict. N-diethyl intolbumide. It kills all the bugs, and it kills your insides. O is for oxygenless recreation. P for pollution in each inhalation. Q is for quicksilver. Fishing is wrecked. R, deadly radon that's hard to detect. S is for sunscreen, and also the sun. Both give you cancer. Now isn't that fun? T for tobacco. UV for UV. W for watching way too much TV. X, as expected, is X-ray. And Y is surprisingly yerba mate. Z is for Zion, as we have the insistence that we have the key to eternal existence. You can't avoid danger. Just go on and try. No matter your choices, without God, you'll die. I thought that that was a fun poem, and I just want to put a few little notes to go with it. The part about kale, while kale can lead to hyperthyroidism, you need to eat vast quantities of it. Unless you're eating kale 3 times a day and juicing kale and getting up in the middle of the night to satisfy your kale cravings, you're pretty safe with that. So today we're going to have a look at health. We're going to have a look at health from a holistic point of view. Generally, when people speak about health, they speak about the physical aspect of health. They generally talk about diet and exercise and things like that, and this is something that is very important. However, this is just one aspect of health. And while you may be physically healthy, I know a bunch of people who go to the gym regularly, they eat the right foods, and their physical health is great. However, their emotional health, their mental health, their spiritual health is really, really struggling. For you to be actually healthy, you can't just be healthy in one aspect. You need to have a holistic look at it. You need to be healthy in your mind. You need to be healthy spiritually with God. You need to be healthy mentally and emotionally as well as physically. Now, with these different aspects of health, I personally believe that one of them is much more important than the rest. Would you have a guess which one that is? Spiritual, yeah. I believe that our spiritual health is of prime importance. And the reason for this is that when you have your spiritual health going really well, that this generally leads to the other parts of health also going well. The other reason that spiritual health is of prime importance is because spiritual health has eternal consequences. It's not just consequences here on this world. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 3 and 4. It says, "They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ." I thought this was a really interesting verse as it brings out the concept that we have something called spiritual food, and we have something that's called spiritual drink. We don't just have the physical food that we have or the physical drink that we can have. We also have a spiritual food and drink. Now, what does this look like? What does our spiritual food look like? Well, Jesus says in John chapter 6, verse 35, I believe it is, he says that I am the bread of life. He who feeds on me shall never hunger. Jesus here is speaking that when we think on him, when we read about him, when we meditate on him, this grows our spiritual life. Now, spiritual food comes in different shapes and forms. But I would say that the most basic spiritual food, the one that we should be consuming the most of, is spending time with God, either in prayer or in reading our Bible. There's other types of spiritual food. For example, you may be listening to some uplifting Christian music. I often find I sometimes lose myself in the car and just listening to music and sing at the top of my lungs. And because it's in the car, it's good, because if I sing with other people, people generally leave. But in the car, there's no one to leave, and I can sing to my heart's content, right? This is another way of consuming spiritual food. And then there is what I like to call a spiritual dessert. And this generally occurs at church. Generally, at church, you'll have the speaker, you may have Pastor Kapushi preaching an amazing message, and you may think, oh, wow, I'd never thought of this from this angle before, and I'd never thought of this, and this is like it's a dessert for us, right? It's our heart is filled up. But the problem is that we can't survive on dessert alone. Think about this. What if your general eating habits was to eat one big dessert once a week? How do you think your body would look? Right?
I'd still be skinny.
You'd still be skinny, yes, that's probably true. But you probably wouldn't be skinny for very long. After a few weeks, you'd probably begin to decompose, you'd get that skinny. We can't survive on dessert alone. And this is the same for our spiritual health. Our spiritual health, we need to partake of God's word daily. We need to meditate on God, to think about God every day if we want our spiritual life, our spiritual health to thrive. Now, I've mentioned this to a few of you before, but before I knew God, I really struggled spiritually. I would spend almost no time with God. I would occasionally go to church and have some spiritual dessert, but this would happen maybe once every 2 or 3 months or something, and that's it. My life was miserable. My health all around was miserable because of this. But when I decided that I'm going to spend time reading the Bible every day, something changed. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't understand why. I looked at what was happening and I was like, I saw that my life completely changed, but now I know that the reason this happened, the reason my life changed is because I was actually beginning to be spiritually fed. My spiritual life began to grow as it should have been up until then. So if you don't get anything else from the talk tonight, this is probably the most important thing. If you want to be healthy, the most important thing is for you to spend time with God, to grow your spiritual life. There's another aspect of health which I wanted us to have a look at, and this is forgiveness. Forgiveness plays an important part in health. If you remember the 5 things that we looked at just before, forgiveness touches on all of them. Forgiveness touches on the social, forgiveness touches on the spiritual, forgiveness touches on the mental, on the emotional, and even on the physical. We're told in Colossians 3:13, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Now here, what we're being told essentially is, we've been forgiven. Therefore, it's our responsibility to forgive those around us. Jesus gives us a really amazing parable about this. And the parable goes something like that there was a king, and there was a man who owed this king a lot of money. We'll say for argument's sake in today's time, he owed him $10 million. And the guy went up to the king and said, look, I have no way to pay. I'm on Centrelink, right? There's no way I can pay the $10 million that I owe you. And the king looked at him and he had pity on him and he said, all right, I'm going to completely wipe your debt clean. And this man walks away, and as he's exiting the building, he sees another guy who owed him a comparatively very small sum of money, let's say $100 or $1,000. And this man said the same thing to him, said, look, I'm also on Centrelink. I have very little money. Please, can you overlook this? Can you give me some more time? And the man was like, no, there's no way. And he grabbed him by the neck and started abusing him and threatening him with the police. And when the king heard about this, he called him in. He's like, what's going on here? Right? I like how Jesus is bringing our mind just to how absurd what happened was, right? You've been forgiven such a huge sum, and now someone owes you a tiny little thing, and you're at this person's throat. And the king punished this man severely. Now, this parable, the king represents God. The man who had the big debt represents me, and it represents you. We each have a huge debt to God. Jesus has paid the price for our sins. He has given the ultimate sacrifice for your sin and for my sin. Now, our response must be that we forgive those around us. If we don't, it would be like the man in the parable. How can we not forgive someone for a little thing that they've done when we have caused the God of the universe to be crucified on our behalf? Forgiveness isn't just something that God has asked us to do simply because, I've forgiven you, you should forgive others, although that's a very good reason. God has asked us to forgive because forgiveness is really important to our health. Forgiveness increases your immune response. I remember reading about this, and I found out that when you are a forgiver, you are less likely to contract things. I actually heard about that someone who is a forgiver is less likely to get AIDS than someone who wasn't a forgiver. I remember when I read this, when I found out about this, I was like, what? That can't be, that's absurd. If you forgive, you're less likely to get it. So I started doing a bit of research and trying to understand how could this possibly be. And I found that the people that forgive, they have lower cortisol and adrenaline in their system. When you're not a forgiver, when you're holding a grudge, when you're bitter against someone, your body produces cortisol and it produces adrenaline. Now, these are flight or fight responses. And when these are produced, your body produces less what's called killer cells. Now, you may think, well, that's probably a good thing. I don't want killer cells inside me, right? But no, it's not a good thing. Killer cells are also known as lymphocytes or white blood cells sometimes. And essentially what they do is they roam around your body and they find intruders and kill them. I actually saw an animation of how one of these cells works. It was really fascinating. It kind of just oozed along to this bacteria and it just enveloped it and just digested it whole. Now, when you don't forgive, you have less of these floating around in your bloodstream. You're more likely to contract the common cold, viruses, various bacterial infections that are around you. I thought that was fascinating, how forgiveness can actually change how sick you get. Another one that I found was interesting, but it was something that I was, oh yes, this makes sense, is forgiveness fosters stronger relationships. And you may say, I see that. But I want you to think about this for a second. When you forgive someone, when you extend grace to someone, that person then wants to extend grace back to you. I heard of a study that suggested that couples who have gone through an event, a serious event where one was required to forgive the other, are actually stronger than couples who have never had to forgive. Now, what am I saying? Am I saying that you should go home and set fire to your wife's favorite painting so that she may have something to forgive you for? No, that's not what I'm saying, though from this premise that may work. But no, probably don't go home and say, Marius told me to set fire to your painting. When we forgive, we grow closer together. It improves our sleep. Forgiveness improves your sleep. And it's quite simple. When you have cortisol and adrenaline in your system, the flight or fight response, this is generally like if you were to see a bear, your body is filled with cortisol and with adrenaline, and you're ready to run. Generally, little children, when they're frightened, they'll often urinate. This is actually a flight or fight response, and the reason it's done is that you weigh less, and if you can lose a few 100 grams, then you can probably run a little bit faster than you could, and than you could with a full bladder. Right? That's how it works. But when you're going through a flight or fight response, when you're trying to sleep, it doesn't help. It doesn't help you sleep. There's another thing that I used to find myself doing, especially before I gave my heart to the Lord. When I had problems and arguments with those around me, I would find myself in bed going over the event again and again and again. And I was like arguing with this person in my mind. And I was, saying, how could you do this and this and this and this? And I would, in my mind, trap them into a corner. You see, I'm right. And I would do this again and again and again, and I couldn't get to sleep. Forgiveness helps you to sleep. It also lightens your load physically. I thought this was really interesting, that you actually can do physically more when you forgive. There was an interesting study that I read about where two groups of students, where one was asked to write a story about when they have forgiven someone, and the other group was asked to write a story of an event that can't be forgiven. Afterwards, the two groups were asked to estimate the incline on a hill. The forgivers estimated the incline to be less than the non-forgivers. They were also asked to jump up and down 5 times. The forgivers jumped, on average, higher than the non-forgivers. Our perception of the difficulties around us decrease as we forgive more. It also increases recovery and decreases recovery time. And again, this is hand in hand with the cortisol and with the adrenaline. Right? When you're trying to recover from something, you don't go and run a marathon, right? You want to sit in bed, you want to rest. And when you're full of cortisol and adrenaline, this hinders your recovery. Therefore, not only are people who forgive less likely to get sick, but they're also more likely to get over their sickness quicker if they do get sick. It also decreases blood pressure. Again, less adrenaline in your system, well, you have a lower blood pressure. It improves your brain function. Studies have shown, CT scans of people who are forgivers show that they have a increased frontal lobe function. So frontal lobe is the area of complex reasoning. It's the seat of the spiritual self, as it would be. It's the area that we do complex reasoning and thinking. Now, when we don't forgive, CT scans have shown that the frontal lobe of people who don't forgive is less active than those who do forgive. They're able to think more critically. They're able to come to answers quicker than those who don't forgive. And this also goes hand in hand with depression. People who are forgivers, because their frontal lobe is more active, are less likely to suffer depression, and vice versa. Those who don't forgive are more likely to suffer depression. Now, let's have a look at our physical health. And you may ask yourself, well, this is a religious talk. Why are we discussing physical health? What has this got to do with the Bible? Well, let's have a look in 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20, where it says, "Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own, for you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Here, we are told some very interesting things. Firstly, we are told that our body is not ours. Our body belongs to God. It's not ours. Therefore, we should respect it. Right? Imagine, Brad, that I lent you my car, and you took it and you trashed it and you crashed it, put a big scratch down the side, right? Filled the boot up with rubbish. Right? I'm not lending you my car, by the way, just so you know. What kind of treatment would this be? Right? The car doesn't belong to him. How could someone treat your possessions in that way? This is the same with our body. Our body is not our own, and therefore we should look after and respect our body because it belongs to God. It is the temple of God, the place where the Holy Spirit resides. Imagine if you would invite God to your house. Would you not clean up your house first? Would you not make sure that you wipe the dust, clean the floors, make sure that the toilets are flushed before God comes to your house? In the same way, our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. We should provide a hospitable place for the Holy Spirit to dwell in us because we were bought with a price. A very, very steep price. Now, in Australia, we suffer from many diseases that are fairly easily treated. 1 in 3 Australians suffer from high blood pressure. This is something that is easily treated. On the way here, I was actually speaking to my father, who's a GP, and he's told me that he has treated many patients that were on multiple medications for blood pressure simply by changing their diet. And they have been able to, some of them, reverse all the medication that they're taking and not take any medications at all. Some of them are now taking half the dose of medication that they were before, or they may have been on 3 or 4 medications. They're now on just 1. Right? This can be done by simply changing our lifestyle and changing our eating habits. 1.7 million Australians have diabetes. A new person gets diabetes in Australia every 5 minutes. Right? This is a serious problem in Australia. And again, this is a problem that can be easily addressed through diet change and lifestyle change. My father also mentioned that he has many people who were suffering from diabetes, had to take various medications for it, but after they started to implement lifestyle changes, their diabetes just went away. He was telling me that I think that he said that he's had 2 or 3 patients this year who have not taking absolutely anything, that at the beginning of the year they suffered from diabetes and they had to take treatment for it. 67% of Australians are overweight. I was looking at that statistic and I was like, wow. 2 out of 3 Australians are overweight. 1 out of 3 Australians are obese. I was actually surprised to find out that 1 out of 4 Australian children are overweight or obese. This leads to many, many health problems. And there's a simple way to find out if you fall into this range is to work out your BMI. Your BMI is calculated by your weight divided by your height squared in meters. And this is something that you can search it on Google, search BMI, and you can easily work out what it is. I actually did mine this afternoon and I found that I'm 26. I'm in the overweight range. So I need to lose some weight, which is something that I'll be doing over the next couple of months. I'm not just speaking to other people, I'm speaking to myself. This is something that I need to address. The Bible tells us that whatever we do, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do everything to the glory of God. I want you to think about that for a second. When you eat, you should be asking yourself, is this to the glory of God? So what are the kinds of things that we should eat? What is our ideal diet? Well, our ideal diet looks something like this. It looks like something with lots of nuts, lots of legumes, lots of fruit and vegetables. Then there's also our not so ideal diet. I've actually put images here of cheese because this is something that I personally really struggle with. I love cheese. All sorts of cheese. I just absolutely love all types of cheese, except the cheese with fruit in it. I don't know what crazy person put fruit in cheese. But besides that, all the rest are amazing, according to me. But I do know that this isn't ideal. This isn't ideal for your body, and we'll be looking at why this is so in a second. Our ideal diet was the diet that God gave to us in Eden. He said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth. Every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they shall be yours for food. So essentially, God is saying, the best food to eat? In Eden, everything was perfect. Everything was perfect. And God said, hey, this is what I want you to eat. This is the best food that you can eat. Besides this, at the time of the flood, God also permitted us to eat certain kinds of meat. And the reason that this happened was because after the flood, there wasn't orange trees around with ripe oranges for people to eat. The flood had just finished. They got off the boat. They needed to eat something. And God permitted us to eat certain kinds of what's called clean meats, which you can look up in the Bible and find out what they are. I was thinking about this, and I was reading in Genesis chapter 47, something that Jacob said to Pharaoh, which I thought was really, really weird. He says, I've traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short. What? 130 years? And you're complaining that your life has been short. I was like, what's wrong with this man? And then I started to have a look at when Jacob was born. Jacob was born around the year 2108 after creation, give or take a few years. Now the flood had occurred around 1658, give or take a few years after creation. So he was born 450 years after the flood, give or take. Now Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. Right? Jacob would have been alive during his lifetime for 50 years. He quite possibly and quite probably knew Shem personally. Also, Noah's great-grandson, Eber is his name, he was also alive during the time of Jacob. He lived 464 years. Then it started to make sense, this verse, because he says, compared to the life of my ancestors, his life has been short. He's comparing himself to Shem. Now, if we put that in the time scale of today, Shem lived 600 years. If you divide that by 5, you'll get 120 years, which is kind of like the maximum life we generally see today. Now, if you look at Jacob's life and divide that by 5, he'd lived 26 years. That's what he's saying. From his perspective, someone's lived 120 years and he's lived 26 years. Oh, it's been a short life, and it was. Why was the life so short after the flood? Well, I believe that there are many factors to this, but I believe that one of these factors was the fact that meat was introduced into the diet. There's a lot of research today that speaks about meat. This is one that I picked out. There's thousands of these articles. It's not just one. This one suggests that physicians should realize that plant-based diets are better for us. Now, I've taken a screenshot of the end of the abstract, which is the short summary of the article. And it says, research shows that plant-based diets are cost-effective, low-risk interventions that may lower BMI, blood pressure, HbA1c, which is an indicator of diabetes, and cholesterol levels. They may also reduce the number of medications needed to treat chronic disease and lower ischemic heart disease mortality rates. Physicians should consider recommending a plant-based diet to all their patients. I want you to think about that. Physicians should consider to recommend a plant-based diet to all their patients. The ones who are sick, the ones who are not so sick, the ones who are young, the ones who are old, all their patients. And then it continues saying, especially those with high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or obesity. Another article spoke about diabetes and how diabetes can be reversed, can be managed simply with a plant-based diet. Now, what's different about a plant-based diet? How does plants differ to animals? Well, it all ultimately comes down to proteins. You see, animals are made up of proteins. Plants are also made up of proteins. This is an image of a protein. This one is called Chi-C. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about this protein, even though it doesn't have much relevance to the talk today, but I just thought it was fascinating. This is a protein that's found in blue-green algae, in unicellular organisms. And this protein has been recently discovered, and they found out that it is a time-keeping protein. I thought that was really interesting. These unicellular organisms have like a clock inside them. We also have these time-keeping proteins in our body, whole complexes of them. And what they do is every 24 hours, they all migrate to the nucleus of the cell, they arrange themselves in specific configurations, and they bind to our DNA, and they express various genes, thousands of genes. It's believed that about 40% of our gene expression is regulated by these time-keeping proteins. So in the morning, they will bind to your DNA and they will give you the proteins that you need for that day. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. But how do animal proteins differ from plant proteins? Because you see, all proteins are made from amino acids. This is an amino acid, this one is glycine. Plant proteins and animal proteins are all made up of the same 20 amino acids. So you may ask, well, how do they differ? If they're all made up of the same thing and when they are metabolized, they all become the same building blocks, why should you eat plant proteins as opposed to animal proteins? Well, animal proteins are much higher in cholesterol than our plant proteins. Cholesterol actually makes up about 50% if you're looking at it from a molecular point of view, 20% if you're looking at it from a weight point of view of your cell membrane. There's a lot of cholesterol in your cell membrane. Now, it used to be thought that we need to supplement this and we need to get various types of cholesterols to be able to help our cell membranes function properly. But it's recently been discovered that all the cholesterol that we need gets made in our own body. Animal proteins are much higher in cholesterol than plant proteins. This causes blockage of the arteries, it causes various heart diseases, heart attacks, and a number of other health problems. Plant proteins also have cholesterols, but they have the good fats, the good cholesterols, as opposed to the ones that are highly saturated. Another reason why animal proteins are nowhere near as good for you as plant proteins is because animal proteins don't have any fiber. In meat, milk, eggs, you'll find zero fiber. Now, in plant proteins, you'll find a lot of fiber. A study that I had a look at in America found that 95% of Americans have an insufficient fiber intake. I want you to think about that for a second. 95%, that's 19 out of 20 people don't have enough fiber. Now, insufficient fiber in your diet has been linked with many problems, the biggest of which being various kinds of cancers. Colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and other types of cancer. It causes inflammation and it causes damages to arteries and to the lining inside the arteries, all because there's not enough fiber in our diets. The metabolization of animal proteins also causes an increased insulin-like growth factor 1. Now, what's this all about? Insulin-like growth factor 1, essentially what this does is it tells your body to grow. It tells your cells to divide, and it tells your normal cells and your cells that are cancerous or predisposed to cancer to also grow. An increased level of IGF-1 has been associated with an increase in almost all types of cancer. When you metabolize animal proteins, you have an increase in TMAO. Now, what's this? This is a substance that's produced in the gut generally by the gut flora. TMAO in your system, it damages your vessels, especially the vessel lining on the interior. It damages it, it causes inflammation, it causes blockages of these arteries, it causes heart attacks, and it can cause strokes. Now, this is predominantly due to animal proteins in our diet. Another one is animal proteins have more phosphorus than plant proteins. Phosphorus, as it's is metabolized by a growth factor called FGF23. Now, this has also been linked with damaged vessels, with increased risk of stroke, increased risk of sudden death, increased risk of heart attack, all because of animal proteins. The last one that I wanted us to have a look at is an increased sulfur. Now, animal proteins have many more sulfide bonds than do plant proteins. As they're metabolized, it causes something known as acidosis. Now, acidosis, as the name implies, is just simply a more acidic environment in the cells. Now, what does the body do to counteract this acidity? It removes calcium from your bones to neutralize this acidity. I go to doctor's offices and I get really irritated sometimes. I see these posters from an old way of thinking that are still around in our doctor's offices that say, drink a glass of milk for calcium, right? There's a lot of calcium in milk. And while this is true, there is a lot of calcium in milk. As milk is metabolized due to acidosis and the calcium that's removed from your bones, there is a net loss of calcium to your system. Drinking milk doesn't increase the amount of calcium in your system. It actually does exactly the opposite. And it boggles my mind why I still see these posters around the place. People will generally say, oh, you should eat animal proteins because they have all the essential amino acids. Now, this is true. The amino acids, of 20 of them, 9 of them are considered essential amino acids. You need to have them for cell functions. You can get away with little of the other ones, but these ones are essential and you need them. Now, it used to be taught, and it actually still is taught in some textbooks, that animal proteins are good for you because they have all these essential amino acids. However, when you break up an animal protein that's high in these essential amino acids, it's actually damaging to your system. Your system produces an increased IGF-1, and your system doesn't like to metabolize these kinds of proteins. It's much harder on the system, and it causes many more problems than metabolizing plant proteins, where you can still get all the ones you need. You just have to not only eat broccoli, right? You may want to eat something else, right? I have it on good authority. If you only eat broccoli, your hair turns green. But no, that's not true. Although if you do eat too many carrots, you do turn orange. So what does all these things mean? Essentially, a plant-based diet is better. It's quite simple. I've shown you 6 different things that's a problem with animal proteins. There's far more than that. But a plant-based diet is ultimately better for your system. So how can we go about leaning towards a plant-based diet? This is something that I started doing about 5 years ago. I had come across a lot of this research and I decided, all right, my body is the temple of God. I want to honor God with my body. I want to try to live more healthily. So I decided that I'm going to try to eat vegetarian. Now this is not easy to do. I don't know if any of you have tried it. It's very hard to do when you've been, especially like I came from communist Romania where meat was something that we loved, and especially when we came to Australia, we loved our meat. What I did is I decided to become a Melbourne vegetarian, that's what I called it, which was, so long as I was in Melbourne, I would eat vegetarian. If I would go on holidays, or if I would leave Melbourne, then I would eat meat. And yes, I did actually eat KFC. This actually worked really well for me. I did this for 8 months and then I met Gabrielle. Now Gabrielle has never eaten meat in her life. And as soon as I started talking to her, I said, okay, it's time to make the switch. And because I had done this already for 8 months and I was essentially vegetarian anyway, it was a lot easier. Some people may find becoming vegetarian too difficult. Another thing that you may like to consider is trying to be a weekday vegetarian, meaning that during the week you eat vegetarian. Any decrease in animal protein is good for your system. So it's better to do 5 days a week than to do no days a week. Today we've looked at 3 main aspects of health. We've looked at our spiritual health. This is what I consider to be the most important. We've looked at forgiveness and the impact that this has on every part of our health. And we've looked at our diet. Now, if someone wants to follow this up, if someone decides that they would like to make a change in their diet and in their way of eating, have a look at New Start. Has anyone here heard of New Start? I see a few people raising their hands and some nodding their heads. New Start is a really good way of approaching a lifestyle change. If you just type in New Start Health or come and speak to me afterwards, I'll show you how to look it up. This is a really good and relatively easy way to approach trying to change your lifestyle for better health. At the end of the day, what we're looking for is a healthier life while we're here on this earth. We're told in Proverbs that do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. The Bible encourages us to live a healthy life. A healthy life means that we can have a closer connection with God. And ultimately, when we have a closer connection to God, it gives us the strength to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.